Have you ever changed your mind even though you knew the facts said exactly the opposite? Have you ever had that moment when everything was clear, the data made sense, logic pointed in one direction, and yet you felt something different, and decided to follow that feeling? If this has ever happened to you, don't worry, it's not a lack of intelligence, it's not weakness, and it's certainly not a lack of information. In fact, this happens to everyone. And what you're about to discover might surprise you. We like to believe that we make rational decisions. That we analyze, compare, weigh the pros and cons and only then choose. But, in practice, the human brain doesn't work exactly like that. Many of the most important decisions in our lives, from simple everyday choices to deep opinions about people, situations and even reality, are guided much more by emotion than by facts. And the most curious thing is, we almost never realize this is happening. Have you ever experienced this? Someone presented you with solid arguments, clear evidence, reliable numbers, and yet something inside you said, "I disagree?" Sometimes the feeling comes even before you can explain why. Only later does the brain find a logical justification to defend what you already felt. It's as if emotion takes the wheel, and reason only comes in later to confirm the path. This doesn't happen because we are irrational. The truth is that the brain has been shaped over thousands of years to prioritize emotions. Emotion is fast. Emotion is efficient. Emotion helps us decide in milliseconds whether something is safe or dangerous, reliable or threatening. Facts, on the other hand, require time, analysis, comparison, and mental effort. And the brain, always economical, prefers the shortest path. That's why news that evokes fear spreads faster than a technical explanation. That's why emotional stories are more convincing than statistics. That's why we often believe something not because it's true, but because it makes emotional sense. The brain trusts emotion because it seems more real, more urgent, closer to our survival. Perhaps you're thinking now, but I'm a logical person. Most people think that. But logic and emotion aren't opposites in the brain, they're deeply connected. Emotions influence how we interpret facts, select information, and even remember the past. When something touches a strong emotion, the brain marks it as important. And everything that comes after goes through this emotional filter. Notice how this comes up in discussions on social media, in relationships, in consumer choices. How many times does someone change their mind not because the facts have changed, but because their emotions have changed? An experience, a disappointment, a fear, or a sense of belonging can completely alter how we perceive reality. Stay with me until the end because understanding this mechanism changes the way you look at your own thoughts. It's not about eliminating emotion, that's impossible. But understanding why the brain trusts emotion more than facts is the first step to seeing decisions, beliefs, and even conflicts in a completely different way. Now that you've realized that logic isn't always in control, the question remains, what exactly happens inside the brain that gives emotion such power? That's what we're going to start exploring from here on out. And as we delve deeper into this topic, I'd like to invite you to actively participate in this conversation. Because everything we're discussing here isn't distant theory, it's something that permeates real life, the decisions you make, the opinions you defend, and even the emotions you feel without realizing it. So, if this topic resonates with you, leave a comment below about what has touched you the most so far. Perhaps a situation where you followed your emotions even knowing the facts, perhaps a decision that makes more sense now when you look at it from this perspective. Your experience can help other people who are going through the exact same thing. If at any point during this video you thought, "This happens to me," please like the video. This simple gesture shows the algorithm that this type of content matters and helps this message reach more people who also wonder why the brain works this way. That's how this space continues to exist and grow, with people who recognize themselves in the content and choose to support it. And if you enjoy exploring these mysteries of the brain, the mind, and how we construct our own reality, subscribe to the channel. It's not just about watching more videos, it's about being part of a curious community that questions the obvious and tries to understand what happens behind our choices. Each subscription strengthens this project and allows us to continue delving deeper into topics that usually go unnoticed. Now, with that in mind, let's take the next step. Because understanding that emotion takes priority already changes a lot. But what truly transforms the way you think is discovering a Zan, because this is how the brain works internally. And that's exactly what we're going to start unraveling from now on. There's a silent illusion that accompanies almost all of us throughout life. The idea that we are rational beings who calmly analyze facts, weigh pros and cons, evaluate scenarios, and only then make well-founded decisions. This image is comfortable. It sustains the feeling of control, maturity, and intelligence. But it only takes observing one's own behavior for a few moments, with a little more honesty, to realize that this narrative begins to fail. Because, in practice, many of our choices are born long before logic comes into play. The human brain wasn't designed to seek the truth. This statement sounds strange at first glance, almost like a provocation, but it's essential to understanding everything we're exploring here. The brain's primary function has never been to be fair, impartial, or logical. The priority has always been something else: survival. Keeping the body safe, avoiding threats, conserving energy, and reacting quickly to the environment. Objective truth, cold facts, and pure logic have always taken a backseat to the need to stay alive. For most of human history, there was no room for lengthy analysis. An unexpected noise, a strange movement, or a sign of danger demanded an immediate reaction. Those who stopped to reflect too much simply did not survive. Therefore, emotions like fear, alertness, pleasure, and aversion became central tools of mental functioning. They are quick, automatic, and effective. They don't ask if something is true, they ask if something represents risk or safety. The curious, and often unsettling, point is that this same ancestral brain continues to operate within us today. It still reacts as if every decision were a matter of life or death, even when we are dealing with modern choices, opinion debates, personal relationships, or professional decisions. The emotional system kicks in first, shaping perceptions, filtering information, and guiding the mindset before reason has any real chance of taking over. This is how the illusion of rationality is born. Because after emotion decides, the brain does something impressive. It constructs a logical explanation. It creates coherent arguments, organizes ideas, selects facts that confirm that initial choice. When you observe this final result, everything seems to make sense. The decision seems rational, well thought out, conscious. But behind the scenes, the direction had already been defined long before, guided by feelings, past experiences, and emotional states. This process profoundly influences how we deal with information. It's not that facts aren't important. They are, but only after passing through the emotional filter. If information threatens a belief that brings us security, belonging, or identity, the brain tends to reject it, distort it, or simply ignore it. Not because it's false, but because it generates discomfort. And the brain, true to its original function, avoids discomfort whenever possible. This is one of the hardest hidden truths to accept about the human mind. We don't choose what to believe based solely on evidence, but on the emotional impact it has. Ideas that protect us emotionally seem more true. Beliefs that reinforce who we believe ourselves to be sound more reliable. Little by little, we construct a reality that makes sense emotionally, even if it's not the most accurate from a purely theoretical point of view. This dynamic subtly appears in everyday decisions. From small choices to deeper stances, the brain seeks emotional coherence. It wants to maintain a stable narrative about who we are, what we believe in, and how we see the world. When something threatens this narrative, the reaction is not curiosity but resistance. It's as if the mind were saying, "This doesn't resonate with me," even before evaluating whether it's true or not. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because understanding this illusion isn't just a scientific curiosity. It changes how you observe your own thoughts, decisions, and reactions. When you realize that the brain prioritizes survival, you begin to understand why changing your mind is so difficult, why logical arguments don't always work, and why certain truths seem invisible to some people, including ourselves. This mechanism influences personal transformations, life choices, and how we interpret past experiences. It shapes the journey each person takes, often without us realizing who is truly in control. Reason believes it leads, but frequently it is merely organizing the path after emotion has already decided the direction. The more you observe this happening, the clearer it becomes that it's not a flaw but a system. An old system, efficient for survival, but not always aligned with the complexity of the current world. This is where the deepest revelations about decisions, mindset, and the real impact of emotions on the construction of our reality begin. Because when you understand this inner workings, you start to see choices and truths with different eyes. Not with judgment but with awareness. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." When we begin to observe the workings of the brain more attentively, one thing becomes increasingly clear. Emotion is not a detail in the decision-making process, it's the main shortcut. It functions as a mental expressway, a fast path the brain uses to respond to the world without needing to stop, analyze, and calculate all the possibilities. And this doesn't happen by chance. Emotions are fast because they need to be. They arise before conscious reflection, before words, before logic. When you feel something, the brain has already taken an initial position on that situation. This emotional shortcut exists because thinking is hard work. Analyzing facts, comparing information, and evaluating consequences requires energy, time, and focus. The brain, by nature, tries to conserve resources. It always seeks the most energy-efficient solution, not the most precise one. Emotion, in this sense, is extremely efficient. In a few milliseconds, it offers a ready answer. This is good, this is bad, this is dangerous, this is safe. And for a brain shaped by survival, this is more than enough in most situations. What many people don't realize is that this emotional shortcut continues to be used even when there's no real danger involved. It comes into play in conversations, discussions, important decisions, moral judgments, and personal choices. Before you even formulate a rational argument, your brain has already sensed something. This initial feeling guides the direction of your thinking, sets the tone of your response, and influences which facts will be considered relevant. Everything else comes afterward, almost like fine-tuning something that's already been decided behind the scenes. Under pressure, this process becomes even more evident. When we are tired, stressed, anxious, or emotionally involved, the brain practically shuts down the long path of analysis and relies almost entirely on these shortcuts. Speed becomes the absolute priority. It doesn't matter if the conclusion is accurate or fair. What matters is that it is quick. It is at this point that impulsive decisions arise, judgments become more rigid, and truth begins to mold itself to the emotion of the moment. This preference for speed helps explain why, in intense situations, intelligent people make decisions that later seem incoherent. It's not that logic disappears, it just loses ground. The brain understands that there is no time for deep reflection. It accesses emotional memories, past experiences, bodily sensations, and uses all of this as a basis for deciding. It's an automatic, silent process and, most of the time, invisible to the person experiencing it. This mechanism has a profound impact on the mindset we build throughout life. Gradually, we come to trust our feelings more than evidence, what seems right more than what can be proven. Repeated emotions become beliefs. Reinforced beliefs become identity. And when something threatens the structure, the brain reacts defensively, not analytically. It protects the internal narrative because it represents emotional stability. There is a hidden truth in this process that is rarely discussed clearly. The brain doesn't want to be right, it wants to be sure. Precision requires doubt. Speed requires conviction. And emotional conviction is much easier to sustain than a nuanced analysis. That's why simple ideas, charged with emotion, spread so powerfully. They require little mental effort and offer quick answers to a complex world. This dynamic influences decisions, both small and large. From impulsive choices to stances that shape relationships and life trajectories. The emotional shortcut creates a feeling of certainty, even when the facts are ambiguous. And this feeling is powerful. It reduces anxiety, brings comfort, and offers direction. The brain interprets this as something positive, even if the decision is not the most appropriate in the long run. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding emotion as a shortcut is only the beginning. When you realize that the brain prefers speed to accuracy, you begin to see your own reactions more clearly. You start to notice how certain decisions arise readily, without internal debate, and how reason only comes in later to justify the chosen path. This perception changes the way you observe yourself and how you interpret the behavior of others. This is an important turning point on this journey. Not to eliminate emotions, but to recognize the real impact they have behind the scenes of the mind. When you understand this mechanism, you begin to realize that many certainties are, in fact, quick emotional responses disguised as logic. And this opens up space for something bigger: awareness. Awareness of decisions, of mindset, and of how the reality we live in is built from these invisible shortcuts. The more you understand how this works, the more you realize it's not a weakness or a mistake, but a profoundly human system. An efficient, fast, and adaptive system, but one that doesn't always deliver the complete truth. It delivers what maintains a sense of control and security. And it is precisely at this point that the deepest revelations begin about how emotions shape perceptions, choices, and even what we call reality. Comment below, I'm on this journey too. When we talk about emotions guiding decisions, three forces stand out with top priority behind the scenes in the brain: fear, safety, and reward. These emotions not only influence thought, they command the hierarchy of what deserves immediate attention. The brain treats any sign of threat, protection, or pleasure as something urgent, worthy of being processed before any rational analysis. It's no exaggeration to say that, in the face of these emotions, everything else becomes noise. Fear, for example, is one of the oldest and most powerful mechanisms of the human mind. It doesn't ask permission to enter, it doesn't wait for confirmation, and it doesn't calmly analyze context. When the brain detects something that it seems if it's threatening, he reacts as if it were real. It matters little whether the danger is concrete or merely symbolic. Criticism, rejection, the possibility of loss, or even an idea that shakes a deep-seated belief can activate the same emotional alert circuit. The body reacts, attention narrows, and the mind goes into defensive mode. In this state, the search for truth loses relevance. The focus shifts to protection. Protecting physical, emotional, social, or psychological integrity. This is why information that evokes fear tends to dominate thoughts, conversations, and decisions. It sticks in the brain because it carries a survival signal. The brain understands that it needs to be remembered, repeated, and taken seriously. Cold data, statistics, or neutral explanations simply don't compete on the same level. Security functions as the other side of the same coin. Anything that generates a feeling of stability, belonging, and predictability is valued by the brain. Comforting ideas, narratives that explain the world simply, and beliefs that reinforce identity produce a sense of emotional security. And this feeling is profoundly rewarding. The brain quickly learns which thoughts bring relief and which generate discomfort. Gradually, it begins to prioritize the former and avoid the latter. Reward completes this powerful trio. Emotions linked to pleasure, recognition, and validation have a direct impact on memory and decision-making. When something generates emotional pleasure, whether it's approval, a feeling of being right, or belonging to a group, the brain registers it as something valuable. This experience is reinforced internally, increasing the likelihood of similar choices in the future. It's not a conscious decision, it's a silent emotional learning process. This is where the connection between emotion, memory, and decision becomes clearer. The brain doesn't register experiences solely based on what happened, but on how it made you feel. Intense emotions act as markers. They tell the brain, "This is important, remember this." That's why emotionally charged memories are more vivid, more accessible, and more influential. Even if the factual details are imprecise, the feeling remains strong, and it's this feeling that guides future decisions. This is one of the most important revelations of this journey. Information linked to emotion creates deeper pathways in memory. They shape perceptions, expectations, and choices. Cold data requires conscious effort to be remembered. Emotions do not. They settle in automatically. And when the time comes to decide, the brain consults these emotional pathways before any logical analysis. This process explains why many decisions seem instantaneous. The mind doesn't start from scratch with each choice. It accesses a bank of emotional experiences accumulated throughout life. Old fears, past rewards, feelings of security or threat are activated in seconds. The decision arises as a right or wrong feeling, even when the person cannot explain why. Logic comes in later, trying to give rational form to something that has already been defined emotionally. The impact of this on mindset is profound. Gradually, we come to trust our feelings more than our analysis. Not because we are careless, but because the brain learns that emotion works. It is quick, efficient, and, from an evolutionary point of view, reliable. The problem arises when this same mechanism is applied to complex situations, where the threat is not physical and the reward is not immediate. Even so, the brain reacts as if it were. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the role of fear, safety, and reward opens an important door to understanding choices that seem contradictory. When you begin to see how these emotions shape memory and decision-making, you start to realize that many certainties are built on past feelings, not on current analyses. This changes how you interpret your own reactions and those of others. This understanding has a direct impact on personal transformation. It reveals the inner workings of decisions that define trajectories, relationships, and worldviews. It shows that many truths we defend with conviction are sustained more by emotional comfort than by evidence. And recognizing this doesn't weaken anyone. On the contrary, it broadens awareness of how the mind truly works. The more you observe this process in action, the more you realize that emotion and memory go hand in hand, silently shaping choices. The brain doesn't first ask, "Is this true?" but "Does this protect me? Does this reward me? Does this keep me safe?" Only then comes the rational narrative. It is in this space that the great revelations begin about how decisions are made and how the reality we live in is constructed internally. Comment below, "That makes sense to me." There's a point where many people get confused when trying to understand human behavior. The belief that well-presented facts, clear numbers, and logical arguments should be enough to change someone's opinion. In theory, this makes perfect sense. If the information is true, proven, and coherent, the natural course would be to accept it. But in practice, this rarely happens. And it's not because people are stubborn or ignorant. It's because the brain doesn't function as a neutral court in search of truth, but rather as a highly sophisticated emotional defense system. When an opinion is already formed, it doesn't exist merely as a detached idea. It's connected to emotions, experiences, identity, and a sense of belonging. Questioning that opinion isn't just presenting new data, it's threatening an internal set of security measures. And the brain reacts to threats with resistance. Cold statistics, however accurate they may be, don't speak directly to this emotional system. They speak to reason, but what's in control at that moment is another instance. This is why logical arguments fail so often in heated debates. The more emotionally invested someone feels in a belief, the more the brain goes into defensive mode. In this state, new information is not evaluated impartially. It is filtered, distorted, or discarded based on a silent question. Does this threaten or protect what I already feel is true? If it threatens, the tendency is to reject it, regardless of the quality of the evidence. There is a hidden truth in this process that cognitive science has demonstrated in various ways. The brain doesn't evaluate facts to decide what to believe, it evaluates facts to justify what it already believes. Emotion comes first, logic enters later as a defense attorney. This explains why two people can look at the same data and arrive at completely opposite conclusions. It's not a contest of intelligence, it's a contest of pre-existing emotions. This mechanism has a profound impact on the decisions that shape our journey. Political opinions, personal beliefs, worldviews, and even career choices often remain intact even in the face of clear contrary evidence. The brain prefers to preserve emotional consistency rather than revise convictions. Changing one's mind requires more than understanding an argument. It requires dealing with the internal discomfort of abandoning a narrative that offered security. From a scientific standpoint, this is not a random defect. It's an adaptive trait. A brain that changed direction with every new piece of information would be unstable, anxious, and unpredictable. For survival, consistency was more important than accuracy. The problem is that this same system, extremely efficient in the past, now operates in an environment full of complex, ambiguous, and contradictory information. Yet, it continues to use the same emotional criteria to decide what to trust. When someone presents facts that contradict an emotional belief, the brain doesn't interpret it as an invitation to reflection, but as an attack. The automatic reaction isn't curiosity, it's defense. And the stronger the emotion associated with the belief, the more intense this defense becomes. That's why, often, the more you try to convince someone with data, the more resistant that person becomes. The brain understands that it needs to protect something important. This process also explains why emotional stories have more impact than statistics. A narrative evokes empathy, activates emotional memory, and creates identification. Numbers require cognitive effort. Stories flow naturally. The brain trusts what it can feel more than what it needs to calculate. This is not intellectual weakness, it is basic neurological functioning. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding why facts alone don't change opinions reveals something essential about real transformation. Lasting changes don't happen just at the informational level, but at the emotional level. As long as a belief continues to offer a sense of security, belonging, or emotional reward, it will be defended, even if it conflicts with objective reality. This understanding changes how you view discussions, conflicts, and even your own thoughts. It becomes clear that convincing someone isn't just about presenting the truth, but about creating an emotional space where that truth isn't perceived as a threat. And this applies to you too. How many ideas have you automatically rejected not because they were false, but because they shook something that seemed secure? This is a point of great impact on mindset. It reveals the inner workings of human decisions and dismantles the fantasy that we are guided solely by reason. Upon realizing this, the journey ceases to be about who is right or wrong and becomes about how emotions shape perceptions. This understanding doesn't conclude the matter. It opens a deeper layer of revelations about how beliefs are formed, defended, and eventually transformed. Comment below, that makes sense to me. At some point in this whole process, something even more subtle happens within the mind. Emotion not only influences the decision, it begins to rewrite reality itself. Not in the sense of inventing things out of thin air, but in the sense of reorganizing perceptions so that everything continues to make emotional sense. The brain has a deep need for internal coherence. It prefers a consistent story, even if distorted, to a fragmented truth that generates emotional conflict. When we feel something strong, fear, anger, attachment, pride, security, that emotion begins to function as a central axis. From it, perceptions are adjusted, memories are reinterpreted, and information takes on different weights. What confirms the emotion seems clearer, more reliable, more real. What threatens that emotion becomes nebulous, questionable, or simply irrelevant. It's not a conscious process. It's automatic. It's the brain protecting the stability of its own narrative. That's why, often, two people experience the same situation and come away with completely different versions of what happened. Not because one is lying, but because each brain has organized the facts to maintain emotional coherence. Perceived reality becomes shaped less by what objectively happened and more by what needs to make sense internally. This is one of the most fascinating and unsettling aspects of how the mind works. At this point, something happens that goes unnoticed by most people. First we feel, then we explain. The sensation comes before the explanation. The emotional judgment arises in milliseconds. Only then does the brain begin to search for reasons, arguments, and facts to support that initial sensation. When this justification is ready, it seems logical, well-structured, almost irrefutable. And because the explanation sounds rational, we have the impression that we think before we feel. But the order was exactly the opposite. This mechanism is extremely efficient at maintaining a stable identity. Imagine the psychological cost of constantly questioning everything we feel is true. The brain avoids this wear and tear. It prefers to align perceptions with existing emotions rather than open space for deep doubts. Doubt consumes energy, generates anxiety, and threatens the feeling of control. Emotional coherence, even if based on subtle distortions, offers comfort. This is where the mystery deepens. The brain doesn't just select facts, it constructs a complete narrative. An internal story that explains the world, people, and itself. This narrative includes motivations, intentions, and meanings. And the more emotionally charged it is, the more convincing it becomes. Not because it's more true, but because it's more aligned with what we need to feel in order to move forward. This internal narrative has a direct impact on the decisions we make throughout life. Choices seem obvious when they fit the story we tell ourselves. Alternative paths aren't even considered because they don't align with the version of reality being maintained. Gradually, the mindset closes in on this narrative, and anything that deviates from it begins to seem wrong, strange, or threatening. This process also shapes memory. Memories are not neutral files stored in a drawer. They are constantly revisited and reinterpreted in light of the emotional present. A past experience can take on new meanings depending on how we feel today. The brain adjusts details, emphasizes certain aspects and minimizes others so that the story remains coherent. Memory then serves the narrative, not necessarily the facts. This is a crucial turning point in how we understand the human mind. We are not merely observers of reality, we are active narrators of it. The brain is constantly editing, adjusting, and organizing experiences to make emotional sense. And the stronger the emotion involved, the greater the chance of distortion. Not out of malice, but out of psychological necessity. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because realizing that emotion can rewrite reality completely changes how you view conflicts, certainties, and even regrets. Many decisions that seem obvious are only obvious within a specific narrative. Outside of it, they could be seen differently. And this applies to you, to me, and to anyone. This understanding has a silent but powerful impact. It invites a more curious and less defensive stance towards one's own certainties. When you realize that the brain creates seemingly rational stories to justify emotions, you begin to wonder where these stories come from and whom they serve. Not as an accusation, but as an internal investigation. An investigation that is part of a journey of awareness. The most interesting thing is that this internal narrative rarely presents itself as emotion. It presents itself as logic, common sense, obvious reality. That's why questioning it seems so uncomfortable. We're not just questioning an idea, we're touching the structure that sustains our worldview. And the brain reacts to this as if it were a real threat. The more you understand this mechanism, the more you realize that many truths we firmly defend are, in fact, well-organized emotional constructs. They function, provide stability, and guide decisions. But they don't always reveal the full complexity of reality. Recognizing this doesn't weaken anyone. On the contrary, it expands the ability to see beyond one's own narrative. And it is precisely at this point that the conversation begins to gain another depth. Because when we understand how the brain distorts perceptions to maintain emotional coherence, an inevitable question arises about what happens when this coherence is consciously challenged. That's when new revelations begin to form, opening up space to understand the extent of the power of emotion and where, in fact, reason can enter. Write this down, that makes sense to me. When we look at all this through the lens of evolution, many things begin to make sense. This predominance of emotion over facts didn't happen by chance, nor is it a systemic error. It was essential for the human species to get to where it is today. In a hostile, unpredictable environment full of real threats, reacting quickly was the difference between life and death. There was no room for deep reflection, scenario analysis, or careful consideration. The brain needed to decide in fractions of a second. Imagine our ancestors faced with an unexpected sound in the forest. There was no time to wonder if it was really a predator or just the wind. Those who felt fear and reacted immediately had a better chance of surviving. Those who stopped to think too much, to look for evidence, or to question their own feelings, often didn't return to tell the tale. In this context, emotion wasn't a problem, it was an extremely efficient solution. This is a central point in this journey of understanding. The emotional brain was a powerful evolutionary advantage. It allowed for quick responses, instinctive decisions, and automatic behaviors that protected life. Fear made us run. Repulsion made us avoid dangerous foods. Pleasure reinforced beneficial behaviors. All of this happened without conscious reflection, because thinking consumes time and energy, two scarce resources in environments of constant risk. Overthinking, in that context, could mean not surviving. The mind needed to act before understanding. And this pattern was reinforced generation after generation. Brains that relied on quick emotions thrived. Those that demanded proof, calculations, and detailed analysis simply couldn't keep up with the pace of natural selection. Gradually, this system consolidated itself as the dominant pattern of human functioning. What we often forget is that this same brain is still here. Despite living in a completely different world with technology, comfort, and relative security, the emotional system continues to run in the background. It hasn't been switched off, replaced, or updated for modern reality. It remains active, silent, and extremely influential. The modern brain carries within it an ancient brain, operating with rules that made sense thousands of years ago. This is one of the most fascinating behind-the-scenes aspects of the human mind. Even when dealing with abstract decisions, opinions, beliefs, debates, career choices, or emotional conflicts, the brain reacts as if it were facing real physical threats. Disagreement can be felt as an attack. Contrary information can be perceived as a risk. A change of opinion can generate the same anxiety as the loss of security in the ancestral environment. This evolutionary legacy profoundly shapes our mindset. The brain still prioritizes speed, not precision. It prefers to act quickly rather than be absolutely right. In evolutionary terms, this made perfect sense. Failing fast and surviving was better than being right too late. The problem is that, in today's world, this same mechanism can generate hasty decisions, distorted judgments, and unnecessary conflicts. But it's important to understand, this is not a moral, intellectual, or emotional failing. It's a deeply ingrained human trait. Recognizing this changes how we see ourselves and others. Instead of judging emotional reactions as weakness, we begin to see them as remnants of a system that worked very well for most of our history. A system that ensured continuity, adaptation, and survival. The modern brain attempts to balance two distinct forces. On one hand, reason, capable of analysis, planning, and reflection. On the other, emotion, quick, instinctive, and oriented towards protection. These two layers do not compete on equal footing. Emotion usually arrives first, sets the tone, and creates the foundation upon which reason will work. Logic does not enter neutral ground, it enters a space already emotionally marked. This understanding has a profound impact on how we interpret human decisions. Many choices that seem irrational make sense when viewed from an evolutionary perspective. The brain is not interested in absolute truths, but in keeping the organism safe, stable, and functional. Objective truth only matters if it does not threaten this stability. Otherwise, it is adjusted, reinterpreted, or rejected. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding this evolutionary legacy leads us to an inevitable question. What happens when a brain shaped to survive in hostile environments needs to deal with a complex, symbolic world full of abstract information? How does this ancient system influence modern decisions, social relationships, and even the way we see ourselves? This is a crucial turning point in the journey of understanding the mind. When you realize that the modern brain still operates with old codes, you begin to observe your own reactions more clearly. You start to notice how certain emotions arise automatically, how certain truths seem obvious without analysis, and how decisions present themselves ready-made even before any conscious reflection. This realization doesn't end the matter, it opens up new revelations. Because if the brain carries an ancestral system running in the background, It means that many of our current choices are influenced by mechanisms that weren't designed to deal with today's world. And understanding this clash between evolutionary past and modern reality is essential to comprehending the real impact of emotions on the construction of our experience. The more we delve into this, the clearer it becomes that emotion and reason are not enemies, but different layers of the same system. A system that prioritized survival for thousands of years and now needs to deal with new challenges. It is at this point that the conversation begins to take on another dimension, revealing how this ancient brain manifests itself in everyday situations and influences decisions that go far beyond physical survival. Write this down, I'm on this journey too. When we bring all of this into real life, the impact becomes impossible to ignore. Because this emotional brain, shaped by survival and operating behind the scenes, isn't restricted to extreme or abstract situations. It appears all the time in the most common day-to-day decisions, precisely those in which we believe we are acting consciously and rationally. Relationships, political stances, consumer choices, interactions on social media, all of this is permeated by emotions that we rarely perceive at the moment they decide for us. In relationships, for example, how many choices are made more to avoid emotional discomfort than to seek clarity? Often we don't say what we think to avoid conflict. Other times, we insist on a narrative about someone even in the face of clear signs that something isn't working. The brain prefers to preserve the feeling of emotional security, even if it means ignoring obvious facts. The decision seems logical when we look at it from the inside, but it stems from the fear of losing, of being rejected, or of facing an uncomfortable truth. In politics, this mechanism becomes even more visible. Opinions are rarely formed after in-depth analysis of data, proposals, or consequences. They arise from emotional identification, a sense of belonging, and a perception of threat. When someone attacks a political idea, the brain doesn't interpret it as an intellectual debate, but as an attack on identity. The reaction is emotional, automatic, and defensive. Then come the arguments, the selected statistics, and the justifications that seem rational, but which mainly serve to support what has already been felt. In consumption, the same pattern repeats itself. Purchases don't happen because a product is objectively better, but because it awakens desire, status, comfort, or a sense of reward. The brain responds to emotional stimuli, colors, stories, promises, long before evaluating cost-benefit. Logic comes in later to explain why that choice makes sense. The impact of this is enormous in how we relate to money, needs, and satisfaction. On social media, this process intensifies. Content that evokes anger, fear, indignation, or emotional validation spreads much more forcefully than balanced information. The brain is drawn to what activates strong emotions because it signals relevance. Likes, shares, and comments function as immediate emotional rewards, reinforcing behaviors and opinions without conscious reflection. Gradually, the perception of reality is shaped by what most strongly evokes emotions, not by what offers profound understanding. What's most intriguing is that all of this happens without the person realizing it. Decisions emerge as if they were free, well-thought-out choices, aligned with personal values. But behind the scenes, the emotional brain has already directed the way. Reason only organizes the narrative afterward. This dynamic creates a sense of control, even when we are being guided by invisible impulses. This pattern has a direct impact on everyday mindset. It influences how we judge others, how we react to differing opinions, and how we interpret ambiguous situations. When something bothers us emotionally, the brain tends to seek explanations that confirm this discomfort. When something comforts us, we tend to accept it without questioning. Thus, perceived reality is adjusted to maintain internal coherence, even if this distorts facts or simplifies complex issues. This is where a deep identification with whoever is listening to this now arises. Because everyone has experienced moments when they made a decision, on impulse, and only later realized the real reasons. Or situations where you defended an idea with conviction, even without being able to clearly explain why. Or even occasions when you rejected information almost instantly, feeling that something didn't add up, even without properly analyzing it. These are not character flaws, they are direct manifestations of brain function. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject, because understanding the impact of emotion on everyday decisions opens the door to an important transformation. When you begin to identify these patterns in yourself, something changes in how you observe your own reactions. A different kind of curiosity emerges, one that is less judgmental. Instead of asking, "Why did I do that?" the question becomes, "What was I feeling when I decided that?" This shift in perspective reveals layers that previously went unnoticed. This awareness has a silent but powerful impact. It doesn't eliminate emotion, nor does it transform someone into a rational machine. But it creates a small space between feeling and acting. A space where decisions can be observed before being justified. It is in this interval that great revelations begin about how choices are made and how personal narratives are constructed over time. When you realize that emotions influence decisions even when they aren't perceived, you begin to see conflicts more clearly. You understand why certain conversations stall, why some topics generate disproportionate reactions, and why changing your mind can seem so difficult. It's not just about ideas, but about the emotional structures that underpin a worldview. This understanding doesn't end the journey, it deepens it. Because if emotions shape everyday decisions so intensely, curiosity naturally arises about how to deal with this more consciously. Not to deny the emotional brain, but to understand its limits and where reason can, in fact, come into play. It is at this point that the conversation begins to gain even more depth, revealing paths that are normally hidden. Comment below, that makes sense to me. Recognizing when emotion is in control isn't about mastering the mind, silencing feelings, or adopting a cold stance towards life. Promising that would be unrealistic. The emotional brain isn't an enemy to be defeated, nor a faulty system to be fixed. It's part of the structure that brought us here. True change begins elsewhere, much more subtly, in perception. Perceiving the exact moment when emotion takes the wheel completely alters the dynamics of decision-making. In practice, almost no one notices this moment. Emotion arrives disguised as certainty, intuition, or common sense. It doesn't present itself as emotion. It presents itself as obvious logic. That's why recognizing its presence requires attention. It's not an exercise in control, but in observation. It's noticing when a decision arises ready-made, when an opinion appears accompanied by rigidity, when a reaction comes loaded with urgency. These are signs that something emotional is operating behind the scenes. A common indicator is internal urgency. When the mind demands an immediate response, when there's a feeling that there's no time to think, the emotional brain has likely already kicked in. Another sign is discomfort when faced with simple questions. If a question triggers irritation, defensiveness, or a need for quick justification, it's worth observing what's being protected there. Emotions don't like to be exposed. They prefer to act silently, keeping the narrative intact. It is also revealing to observe the body. Emotions manifest physically before becoming clear thoughts. Tension, acceleration, tightness, heat, impulse. All of this precedes rational explanation. When the body reacts, the decision has already begun to be constructed. Reason arrives later, trying to organize something that has already been felt. Perceiving this chain of events changes the relationship with one's own choices. Not to annul them, but to understand them. This process of recognition has a profound impact on mindset. It shatters the illusion that we are fully aware of everything we do. And paradoxically, this is what expands awareness. By realizing when emotion guides a decision, a small space emerges between feeling and acting. This space is precious. It doesn't eliminate emotion, but it allows for a pause. A pause where different questions can arise, where the automatic narrative can be observed instead of simply followed. Now I want to delve even deeper into this subject because this pause changes everything. It transforms how you approach everyday decisions, internal conflicts, and even regrets. Many choices cease to be seen as right or wrong, and begin to be understood as emotional responses to specific contexts. This understanding brings less judgment and more curiosity. Curiosity about why that emotion arose, what it was trying to protect, and what hidden truth lay behind that reaction. Recognizing emotion as the driving force doesn't mean acting against it. It means acting with it in plain sight. When emotion is seen, it loses some of the invisible power it wielded. The decision continues to be influenced by feelings, but now there is awareness of the impact they have. This changes the quality of the choices. It doesn't make them perfect, but it makes them more aligned with what truly matters in the long run. This journey of self-discovery doesn't happen all at once. It's built gradually, in simple situations, in small decisions, in reactions that previously went unnoticed. Over time, perception deepens. The brain continues to react quickly, continues to seek security and reward, but consciousness begins to keep pace with the process. And when that happens, something interesting emerges: inner freedom. Not the freedom to not feel, but the freedom to not be completely swept away by what one feels. The impact of this spreads to all areas of life. Conversations become less reactive. Conflicts lose some of their personal charge. Opinions become less rigid. Not because everything becomes relative, but because the person begins to see behind the scenes of their own certainties. Truth ceases to be merely what provides emotional comfort and begins to include what can be observed more honestly. This reflection doesn't close the matter, it opens it up. It opens the possibility of seeing the mind as a complex system, full of layers, where emotion and reason coexist all the time. A system that doesn't need to be forcibly controlled, but understood in depth. And the more this understanding grows, the more evident it becomes that many decisions that seem automatic can gain new meanings when observed carefully. It is at this point that the conversation begins to touch on something deeper. Because realizing when emotion is in control inevitably leads to a silent question about who we are when we stop confusing feeling with truth. This question doesn't demand an immediate answer. It simply lingers, echoing, inviting us to look inward with more calm, more curiosity, and less haste to reach a conclusion. Comment below, that makes sense to me. If you've made it this far, some part of this content probably resonated with you. Perhaps an idea resonated with you, or maybe some everyday situation makes more sense now. If this video helped you see your own decisions more clearly, it's worth subscribing to the channel. That's how you can continue to follow reflections like this one, which don't offer ready-made answers, but help you better understand how the mind really works. If at any point you thought this message was for me, leave a comment below with the phrase, "I'm with you until the end, I read everything," and this feedback helps keep this space alive, honest, and connected with those who are truly interested in this type of conversation. And if it made sense to you, leave a like on the video, not as an obligation but as a sign of this exchange that happened here. There's a video over here that perfectly complements this topic and delves even deeper into this journey about mind, emotion, and decisions. Click there and continue reading.